Professor James Walters, welcome to the In Good Faith podcast.
Thanks very much for having me on. I feel very honoured.
Thank you. You are our first Christian guest.
Oh, well,
and
doubly honoured.
and you're in the gear as well, so there's no
there's no disguising
there's
it.
There's no confusion, absolutely. Well, there's a lot I'd like to discuss with you on this Friday afternoon. Certainly the state of Christianity in the country, what's happening, what are the trends, and more generally about religion, faith, the making sense of what's happened in the recent past as well as where things are going in the future. So definitely want to have a broad and wide-ranging discussion with you. But I think it would be really interesting, and just for viewers and listeners, most of whom will be Muslim, and will be really interested to know, I suppose, your perspective in terms of your overall worldview. What do you believe? How do you see the world? What are your main convictions? And then perhaps we can track back and see how they've emerged over time. But as you are today, what is it that you believe, and what are your main convictions?
Gosh, that's straight in at the deep end, isn't it? I suppose if I have to articulate my faith succinctly, it is that I believe that at the heart of our lives and the heart of all that exists is a recreative energy that is the love of God revealed in Jesus Christ, and that the disorder and brokenness of this world will not be fixed simply through human endeavour, but through the extent to which we align ourselves with that divine energy. And when I say it's the love of God revealed in Jesus Christ, it's supremely revealed in the death and resurrection of Jesus, where I think we see God pouring himself out for the renewal of humanity. And for me, that isn't just a moment in history, that is the revelation of what is most real. And so I try to order my life around not just the belief in that, but trying to get in touch with the reality of that every day.
And is that a challenging process? Do you find that a difficult thing? Or is it something that feels very natural to you now?
So I'll give you a bit of the history. I grew up in a church-going family, not kind of madly religious at home, but Sunday was church. And my father was what we call a church warden. I suppose that'd be a sort of equivalent of a mosque committee chair, something like that. My sister and I sang in the choir, so we had a couple of rehearsals every week, and then we would sing at least 2 services on a Sunday. And Christianity was definitely just the water I swam in as a child. And Christianity is a broad church, and there's a sort of a spectrum between Christians who are very Bible text focused, and their services will be sort of about teaching and learning. And then at the other end of the spectrum, those churches that are more focused on ritual and tradition and the history of the church. And within the Church of England, we've got that whole spectrum. And I'm over here. I grew up in what we call Anglo-Catholicism. And so my experience of Christianity as a child wasn't of lots of teaching and doctrine and dogma and things that I had to kind of sign up to. It was just music and incense and the pattern of the church year and kind of just sort of living life around this story of Christianity and having that kind of order life. So that's always been there for me, and there've been different kind of hurdles along the journey and questions I've asked, but I've never not been a Christian, and I've never had a sort of huge crisis of faith, I suppose.
Any recollection as to when the first hurdle sort of came about for you, or that first kind of question, and what were the things that came up, and how did you overcome them?
Right. I think like a lot of people, late adolescence, kind of suddenly realizing, okay, I've been dragged to church every Sunday and I've sung in this church choir, every Sunday. do I want to do this anymore? Is this going to be part of me as an adult going forward? And deciding, okay, I need to kind of ask some questions for myself. And I think at the time, I thought that those questions were essentially empirical questions. Does God exist? Did Jesus rise from the dead? All these kinds of things. And I think it's important to go there, particularly at that age. And I think I came to the conclusion that there is nothing unreasonable about Christianity, but also none of the important things about it are particularly provable through a sort of a rational lens. So then I started to move to what I think are more meaningful questions, which is this a narrative that helps me see the world more truthfully, help me see the world as it truly is, rather than the distortions that that the world says about itself. And also the question, which I think is a question you're interested in as well, of does living this make me the best kind of human I can be? And that does actually get to something at the heart of Christian faith, I think, which is that Christians don't believe, to say that Jesus is the Son of God, to say that Jesus is God, is not to say that Jesus is like a sort of superhero or a superhuman. One of the titles that's used to describe him in the Gospels is Son of Man, which kind of just sort of colloquially just kind of means bloke. But some of the contemporary Bible translators, in order to be more gender inclusive, are translating it as the human one. And I really like that, because I think that for Christians, Jesus reveals what humanity is truly meant to be when the worldly and the divine are properly reconciled, properly integrated. This is what humanity is meant to look like. And that's very troubling, because my life does not look a lot like the life of Jesus of Nazareth. And that's the challenge. That's what we're all trying to kind of live into and wrestle with. But yeah, those are the questions that I shifted to from the more rational things. So I suppose, when we're talking about the sort of left brain to right brain kind of thinking about what faith really is.
So it's interesting now when you're talking about your understanding of who Jesus was, it sounded very, just in those last few words, it sounded as though that would be a perspective that, for example, Muslims would share, in the sense of a fully actualized, Muslims would say, prophet of God, someone who was fully aligned with the divine. You talked about the aligning with that energy, at the beginning. And therefore an example to be followed, right? So it felt to me in what you were saying that actually, yes, the particular part around, was he God, right? Which obviously becomes an issue of contention and difficulty. Could you just elaborate on that a bit further to help sort of me understand, or viewers understand, like, what's the difference here now? Because meaning there seems to be a very fine line between this thing of he was a fully actualized human being in his alignment with the divine and an example to be followed. A lot of people could agree with that, right? But the difference between that and saying, oh, no, he was God,
So I suppose the difference is not just an example to be followed, but the means by which humanity is reconciled with God. And so it's not just living like Jesus. The New Testament talks about living in Jesus, living life in that reconciliation of divinity and humanity that is the person of Jesus Christ, resurrected and ascended, and therefore eternally available to all.
And what is, to your mind, like the practical difference for a person today between the sort of two pathways? Meaning, one, in terms of what they can achieve in terms of their potential. So if we are assessing this from the point of view of becoming the best human we can be, as you mentioned, what actually is a practical difference between seeing it in the way that you've just described it, which for some people might be a difficult kind of step to take, perhaps, or just simply seeing it as, WWJD, right? What would Jesus do?
Right. Yeah. And that, I think, is where it comes to kind of the spiritual practices of Christian faith that go far beyond just a kind of ethics class in how to kind of live more like Jesus. And so it's about participation in the sacramental life of the church, which is about the making present of Jesus within the community today. Do this in remembrance of me. That's not just remembering as in thinking back, it's remembering, it's making the body of Jesus present among us, symbolically in ourselves, spiritually in ourselves. And also in the life of prayer, and I can't speak for Muslim piety in relation to Jesus, but I think the Christian isn't just reflecting on the life of Jesus, they're praying to Jesus, and also, and this is quite important for me, drawing on the passages in the New Testament, but also the spiritual writings of people like Teresa of Avila that are speaking about allowing Jesus to pray within you and allowing that integrated life of humanity and divinity in the person of Jesus to be enthroned in your heart, is how she describes it. So it's about spiritual practice, not just following an example.
Right, okay. And then in your own practice, or perhaps generally amongst Christians, are there specific sort of times or places perhaps where there is almost a prayer to God, or a direct communion or interaction with God, where maybe Jesus is not in a person's kind of mind or conscious at that particular point in time, and then separately, where we might be interacting or thinking about Jesus and or praying to Jesus in a way that, I suppose God the Father maybe is not present. I'm just really trying to understand how it works as a phenomenon in terms of that interaction, or is it all? It's all kind of one and the same all the time, and it's just sort of blending into each other.
So we're talking about the doctrine of the Trinity here, which probably is the greatest source of tension and confusion between Christianity.
But I'm not interested in maybe as much propositionally as just practically.
Yes, and that's very interesting. And I don't think Christians reflect as much on the practice of that and what that looks like as they might do. There are prayers addressed to God the Father, prayers addressed to Jesus the Son, and prayers addressed to the Holy Spirit, and there is that's addressing, in a sense, different aspects, different ways in which we understand God, but they are interchangeable. It is this kind of unity in Trinity that is the mystery that is incomprehensible.
One thing that I've wrestled with, as I think you may know for a while, is methods of theophany, right, which is this divine self-disclosure. It's almost trying to the extent that God is intelligible, to the extent that God is understandable, reasonable.
Yeah.
It's let's take the phenomenon of the Quran as an example. If this is God's word, God's revelation, one of the things, or one of the natural challenges that emerges is, why would God choose to disclose himself so specifically in a particular way with particular instructions in this particular culture and time, etc., and not do so similarly just before, meaning even at the same time, I just think about, whilst this phenomenon of revelation was going on, one time zone to the right and one time zone to the left, people are none the wiser, but this very important a historical, spiritual sort of event is taking place. And even to this day, 1.5 millennia later, there are people who almost have no idea, right? So that's a puzzle. So similarly speaking then, and I am just saying that as a way to say, to make it clear that I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but I'm wrestling with a similar issue over here. Have you ever thought or wondered, well, okay, let's just step back for a second. Even if it was the case that this is how God chose to disclose himself through the person of Jesus, what an odd way to do it.
Yes, completely. And I think the challenge of all revealed religion is the sort of scandal, even absurdity of the particular, of kind of the notion of God intervening in history, in particular points at different times. I remember years ago when I was parish priest preparing a young Chinese man for baptism in the church. And we went through all the classes. He was very diligent. And towards the end, I said, have you got any questions? And he said, well, I have one question. He said, I don't understand why God chose the Jewish people at that point in history, when at that point in history, the Chinese civilization was so great? And I said, that's a good question. I don't know. I've got a hunch that maybe God likes an underdog. And the Chinese civilization maybe wasn't the one he wanted to pick for that reason. But it is something that we wrestle with, isn't it?
How could you say a bit more maybe about how you have then contended with that? So, for example, let's take it's funny you mentioned the Chinese, because oftentimes, even though I have no particular connection to China and the Chinese other than, you know, Amazon products or whatever, it's like, you know, I think about I do think about that. I do in the context of Semitic and Abrahamic kind of religion and faith.
Yeah.
This is the world's largest, you know, country. One of the richest, obviously, histories, cultures, etc. Completely, well, not completely, that would be false, but almost completely, I would say, untouched by, you know, the stories that we are kind of immersed in, let's say. And then again, what does that say to you about God's plan for these people, essentially?
Yeah.
They haven't, from your perspective, largely speaking, they almost haven't been exposed to the good news of Jesus, let's say, and maybe from my perspective, or from, you know, from others, or to the example and the revelation, you know, of the Prophet, Muhammad, peace be upon him.
Well, I mean, just I'll address the principle in a minute, but I mean, on that point, that's increasingly not the case. There's more Christians in church in China on a Sunday than there are in the whole of Europe. You know, so things have really moved. I think, from my perspective as an Anglican Christian, I think we have some notion of the providential outworking of God's purposes within history. And so I think there has to be some notion. I mean, you know, never mind the Chinese civilization. If we follow the Big Bang Theory and evolution, then, you know, things have been around for millions of years. You know, so God's waited a long time. So what's God waited for? I think within my tradition, and I don't know how much I sort of fully go along with this, because it's rather inflected with Western privilege and ways of thinking, but that at that turning point, the beginning of the axial age, humanity has kind of reached a point of readiness to receive this truth. There certainly seems to be at that point in history an openness to the universalism that both our religions, I think, present at that point in human history, when previously that's not really been an idea. I mean, people have been very particular. Religion has been very local in terms of local cults and temples and things like that. And certainly Christianity was born into a Roman Empire that was extremely stratified, extremely hierarchical. And that was one of the very, very radical things about Christianity, that it did say, everybody matters to God. Everybody can be baptized. Everyone is welcome to be part of the church. This is a very, very new thing. And I think you know, Christian thinkers have believed that humanity needed to be at a certain point of consciousness, I suppose, to kind of receive that. I go some way with that, I think.
Okay. I want to bridge over to eventually, like, you know, some of the really practical work that you've been doing in terms of the interfaith work, as well as I mentioned at the beginning, the dynamics of what's happening with Christianity, especially in Britain, but perhaps elsewhere too. Maybe to bridge from the more theological into that, we could just maybe touch a little bit more then in this middle ground on questions of then sort of pluralism and salvation, and how these all interact and how they kind of relate. So we could stay a little bit with the theological or philosophical, perhaps. What are the implications of the worldview that you have laid out for the way in which you now see the other, those who either have sort of heard this message about Jesus, but you know, reject it either in totality or to some, you know, in some sort of partial way, or those who just haven't heard. Essentially, what does this mean for their accountability, the possibility of their salvation? Like, how do you kind of frame these kind of questions?
So I think one of the implications for me of the doctrine of the Trinity, both the incarnation of God into a complex world, and the presence of the Holy Spirit in history, a Holy Spirit which in John's Gospel we hear blows where it will, is that there is truth in creation that we encounter. And I would say that I come from a position that says we believe that there is truth in the story that the church follows, in the teaching of the church, but there is also truth that we encounter outside the church. And my experience of interfaith engagement, I think, has led me to believe that all world religions are an encounter with the divine, and therefore have truth present within them. The question is how effective an encounter they are with the divine, and I'm sort of allergic to interfaith relativism. That just wants to say, well, they're all equally valid routes to the divine nature. I think some paths are better than others.
Well, what makes them better? Are you saying that from a kind of theoretical perspective in terms of some sort of objective analysis of different systems and how they might afford some sort of transformation? Or do you mean just looking at the data, the evidence of, you shall know them by their fruits kind of thing?
I think I was trying to make a theological point that humanity's encounter with God are always a dialogue. And sometimes the human voices and the human will and the human agendas dominate more than the divine voice cuts through. Mm-hmm. And obviously, as a Christian, I believe that in Jesus Christ, in people's encounter with him, we have managed to hear the divine voice more effectively. But that isn't to say that there aren't also human agendas, and that kind of clouds the writing of the New Testament in various respects. And I'm not going to work my way around the world religions and say the ways in which I think they're effective, because
Sure.
that's not going to make me very popular. But I think that's what's at stake in this, of kind of how attentively humans are encountering God.
Yes. Okay. But I still maybe I'm not entirely clear about whether we mean, so for example, again, just bring it back to what you said right at the beginning, which this which I think is a neat way to put it in terms of this alignment with the divine presence and energy.
Yeah.
It sounds like partly what it sounds from what you're saying is that a peak level of alignment relative to someone's potential or circumstances can well be achieved through the multiple pathways that exist within each of these kind of traditions, meaning that actually a person can reach a level of conviction, alignment, and then manifest the various values and principles that we would regard as virtuous and noble. And maybe certain systems make that more difficult, or it might be easier or more difficult depending on, right? But as you well know better than most, each of these, sometimes we think of these things in very reductive terms, as if each of these things is just one thing, when actually within them are a million roots. So is that what we're saying? Meaning that there is this, often the analogy is given of, it's a single mountain essentially, right? There's a peak, that point, and people are coming up their different routes, and maybe this religion over there has a kind of
a windy path.
Yeah, more, exactly. And then you might see Christianity as a more sort of direct. I mean, is that how you see it, or is that not an appropriate analogy?
I don't tend to like that analogy. I don't know if we all end up in the same place. I just don't know. And I have a certain kind of epistemic humility about my theology in that regard. But yeah, I think you said what I think earlier in terms of saying that a religious system is a framework that will either and as you rightly say, there's different religious systems within Christianity, and some I think are pretty terrible. So this isn't an interreligious point, it's right across the board. Some of these systems are going to enable our encounter with God, and others are going to impede them. And so I suppose there is some empirical element to that, in that I think we know a holy person when we see them, and we know an ungodly person when we see them.
Yeah, sure. And we can probably discern elements of both of those within ourselves when we look hard enough. Yeah. Okay.
No, certainly my holy moments and my ungodly moments are very stark.
Okay. All right. So so then, just in terms of, because I'm really interested personally in this issue to do with the day-to-day practicalities of engaging with people of different persuasions, faith traditions, etc.
Right.
whilst at the same time almost having a view that emerges from the doctrines that we ascribe to about the likely end state of so and so person. So, meaning that, our various scriptures and teachings and, perhaps orthodoxies might state in very stark terms, right, what the outcome of a certain person who has a certain type of persuasion, will be or ends up being. And I think that sometimes it's very, some of us, I think we just sort of conveniently forget some of those things whilst we're then
Right.
trying to kind of engage on a day-to-day basis. So I think
Yeah.
maybe what I'm trying to get at here, maybe from a Christian perspective, which is understood and generally understood to be a more an evangelical sort of tradition, is that how do you balance between the urgency of conveying this good news to so and so because of the existential risk almost to a person or a community or a society of not knowing this good news versus
Yeah.
the respect for their free will, their decision making, and maybe a postponement of a judgment actually about where a person will or won't end up.
So I suppose I'm the kind of Christian for whom it's never really made very much sense to think that I have to tell people something and get them to believe something in order to protect them from God. That's never really made much sense to me. And I don't read the New Testament in such a way as makes me think that I am called to label people as in or out and pass judgment on them. I think I'm called to witness to what I believe to be true. And I hope that I kind of do that confidently and generously and in a way that's engaged with where they're coming from and what they believe. Interestingly, I don't. I mean, and I'm interested in the kind of interfaith conversation that is more honest than a lot of interfaith conversations have been. So I think you're right in saying that people sometimes ignore those sorts of beliefs about judgment and salvation, and are reluctant to bring them to the table. And I think I'd encourage them to bring them to the table generously and kind of politely, because that may enable others to bring sort of difficult topics to the conversation as well. But I don't encounter that regularly as a huge impediment to quite important conversations, which people are keen to have.
Okay, and then maybe we're now bridging to the church itself and the current sort of state of play and how things are. The view that you've just described, would you say that is sort of the mainstream attitude at the moment, or the dominant attitude? From as a relatively distant observer, I feel in recent years, I feel that at times you've heard almost a stronger pro-evangelical sort of voice coming through, and at other times it feels no, we don't. That's not the way. We actually just need to do a lot more listening and a lot more just be of service. So where is it possible to characterize where the thrust of, if you like, the church is at the moment?
I mean, one question is which church? I mean, my
Okay, fine.
church, and I think even within the Church of England, there's a huge range of perspectives on this. And I think congregational decline has made us realise that we need to be a little bit more proactive about telling people what Christianity is and trying to engage them with it. And I certainly consider myself as part of that. I remember an elderly priest saying to me once, there's a passage in the gospel which I've got to preach on this Sunday, coincidentally, where Jesus calls the first disciples and they're fishermen, and he says to them, I will teach you to fish for men, I will teach you to fish for people. And this elderly priest said to me, well, that's what Jesus called us to, and I was trained to look after an aquarium. And I think that's a sort of shift from the Christendom model, where we're living in a culture where everyone's basically Christian or culturally Christian, and you just kind of look after the community, to realizing that we actually need to convey what we're about and what this is, and I think that's an important shift in the church. I also really don't see it as being at odds with our support for religious freedom for those who disagree with us, and the imperative for fostering interreligious dialogue. I think it creates more healthy religious dialogue, as I said.
Sure. A lot of analysis has been done on this, but it'd be interesting to understand what you think accounted for, what seemed to happen in the first part of this century, which was this quite a significant sort of exodus, if you like, from out of Christianity from the in the first 20 years or so of the century. What was the reasons for that?
Well, it's been happening for a lot longer than that, and
but the census seemed to capture it much more.
Quite dramatic.
2001
drop.
to 2021. Yeah.
And I think the dramatic drop was the point in British history where we stopped calling apathy Church of England and we called apathy no religion. And by that, I mean, my grandmother's generation, when you went into hospital, they asked, what's your religion? And if you didn't really care, you said C of E. And at some point in that period that you've described, there suddenly became no shame, and actually kind of the norm was to say that you had no religion, and that's so the data looks like this enormous drop in kind of people attending church, and actually there has been a drop in people attending church, but it's been much shallower. So that's a cultural shift that's happened over that period of time. But what's been happening to the Church of England is what's happened to all state churches in Western Europe that were established at the end of the wars of religion with the treaties of Westphalia, allowing states to kind of enforce one religion while allowing some degree of freedom for dissenters. That model has slowly eroded, and we live in societies where people have much more choice, much more information, much more engagement with people of different worldviews and different religions, and so that's just fractured over time, and so we're living in a much more complex, and also I would say kind of less cohesive society, because that diversity is something that we like to celebrate, but it is also really challenging.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. Like, do you welcome the diversity? Or do you sort of see the division and think, actually, it was better. It was better how it was?
Well, I resist the lure of nostalgia, and nostalgia is present in all our religious traditions at the moment, and I think it's proving quite toxic. And yes, you can watch a kind of an Agatha Christie where kind of the vicar's cycling through the village and think, well, that kind of looks like a more cohesive society. But there's plenty of things that we wouldn't have liked about that.
Funny to cite Agatha Christie, because obviously around this ideal vicar cycling down the village, there's a murder. That's just
exactly. Yes, exactly. It's kind of dark forces at work. Yeah. So I resist nostalgia, but I also get frustrated with a kind of naive liberal agenda that just says, that diversity is always a thing to be celebrated. I think what's implicit in people's thinking around that is that basically, religions aren't really making any truth claims, and if we all just kind of celebrated each other's festivals, then we'd all have a lovely time. And I think diversity is much more challenging than that. It's a task that we have to engage with, and a task that I've kind of embraced kind of quite readily. And I think part of the turmoil that we're in as a society at the moment is that rather optimistic liberal view of multiculturalism is clashing with one that is very pessimistic about difference. And is very nostalgic, and so I'm trying to be part of a movement, a project to say, well, this is difficult, but it's a task we have to take up, and we can be a rich and faithful society, taking each other seriously and allowing each other to flourish, and within my own community saying, that is part of being a good Christian, is enabling that and allowing that to happen. And I would say part of being a Christian country, and I do think there is still a sense in which we need to describe ourselves as a Christian country.
I was going to ask about that, actually. Yeah, I was going to ask about if that's accurate, firstly, and then helpful, as far as the future is concerned.
Yeah, two different questions, quite interesting. When people ask, are we a Christian country, what most people mean is, do the majority of people identify as Christian, like a referendum kind of sort of approach. That's one way of thinking about it.
It's not quite the same. Yeah, there's other ways. Yeah.
There's other ways. I think much more relevant in many ways is questions of culture and institutions. I think this is a country that for a very, very long period of time was shaped by Christianity, its teaching, its practices, the shape of the church, the parish system that we have, the fact that there's a great big cathedral not far from us here. And historian Tom Holland's done quite a bit of work on how kind of, so much of what shapes our society in democracy and law and human rights, all these things have kind of emerged out of this Christian culture and this Christian narrative. I think that's very present here. And also, at a very simple sort of structural level, this is a country whose head of state is the last anointed sovereign of Christendom. Now, you might think that's a good thing, you might think it's a terrible thing, but at a very kind of visible and institutional level, I think that does still make us a Christian country in some sense. The question is what kind of Christian country and what that means for people who don't want to be Christian, aren't Christian, or kind of reject that conversation. And actually, I think King Charles is pretty good at modelling the notion that you can have confidence in your history, in the identity of your institutions, and for that very reason, be generous and embracing of diversity, of religious diversity, and take an interest in it, which, of course, he personally does very much. This is not the view that everyone signs up to right now. And, part of what I'm trying to get much more involved with is for people like myself who've been engaged in interreligious conversations for a long time and kind of inhabit this world that we call the interfaith world, I think we need to be much more visibly contributing to conversations about national identity and what it means to be cohesive as a society, and for my own constituency to really understand that this is about being faithful to who we are and the journey we've been on as a church from persecution of minorities, both other Christians and certainly other religions, through toleration, the Toleration Acts, towards allowing freedom of religion.
Bible sales are up in recent years.
Apparently so.
And more young people are attending church as well. Is that despite the efforts of the church, or precisely because the church is organising itself in a particular way to become attractive once again?
I'm not sure, but I'm not persuaded that things have changed because of anything very much that we've done. I think society in the world is changing around us and changing quite dramatically and changing in complicated ways. So yes, Bible sales are up. Yes, young people are expressing more of an interest in Christianity. That's not immediately translating into committed church going, I should say. I think what we can say with some real confidence is that in this 20-year period that you've described, even actually kind of 10 years, what's shifted has been, if you're young and cool, you absolutely don't show any interest in Christianity whatsoever, and you read Richard Dawkins' God Delusion, and you're quite dismissive about religion, towards a situation where there's much more interest, much more respect. And that's partly, I think, through young people's encounter with people of other faiths. 2010, religion and belief became a protected characteristic within the Equality Act in the UK. And so young people have grown up with the idea that other people's religious views are something that you respect, and that you take seriously. And I think that's had a really positive effect on Christianity as well, although, others felt it would go in the other direction. So that's a huge cultural shift, but I don't think it straightforwardly translates into revival of the church, especially not the Church of England, I fear, because I don't think it's necessarily commitment to church going and Christian life and Christian practice in the way that I've known in my life, for example.
I probably should have asked this earlier, but viewers and listeners, some may be sort of confused about when we talk about the Church of England, then we talk about the Anglican Church, and then obviously there's Catholic. Could you just do a really basic sketch of what's what when it comes to this? Is there a simple way just to think about the overall sort of setup in a way that people can just frame, what's happening?
Okay, so sort of through the first millennium and going into the Middle Ages, Christians in Western Europe were part of the Roman Catholic Church, and then what happened in the 16th, 17th centuries was what we call the Reformation, where a lot of Christians were saying that the Roman Catholic Church had kind of allowed too much accretion, too much sort of tradition, which they saw as kind of superstitious and distracting from Christian teaching in the Bible. So that's when Protestantism emerged as Reformed Christians who wanted to take the Bible more seriously, reject the authority of the Pope, and practice Christianity in a less ritualized way. Now, the Church of England is almost unique in being something sort of between these two poles. And basically, under Henry VIII and then his successors, the Church of England moved into being separate from the Roman Catholic Church, rejected the authority of the Pope, but a lot of the practices of Roman Catholicism were retained. So the Church of England, for example, still has bishops, and it has priests and deacons who are other members of the clergy, and we celebrate the Eucharist in a way that will be recognisable to Roman Catholics now. But we also have I guess, certainly until the Counter-Reformation, more of an emphasis on the Bible, and we have an evangelical wing that really, really focuses on that as well. That's probably quite a complicated explanation too, but hopefully that
and so thank you. No, definitely helpful. But and so today, in terms of just numbers, of the Christians that in Britain at the moment, roughly speaking, what are the proportions of people who ascribe to the different sort of groups, if you like?
Okay, so the proportion that is within the Church of England has shrunk a great deal. So I think there is now an equal number of Roman Catholics. We've seen a lot of, and this is part of the picture of how religious demographics have changed in the UK. Yes, we've seen a decline in kind of cultural Christian identification and in the practice of the Church of England, but we've also seen migration of a lot of Christians who are taking their faith seriously, are going to church. So large body of them are Roman Catholics. There's a big proportion of them. And then we've also seen a lot of migrants from Africa and other countries who are bringing more what we call Pentecostal Christianity in. That is on this kind of reformed, Bible-focused side of things, but more what we call charismatic. So their worship is very kind of
exciting.
Exactly. Not like the Church of England. We don't like excitement.
Sure. Right. Okay. Now, one of the phenomena that's sort of started emerging recently is the sort of maybe co-opting, if you want to call it that, of Jesus and of Christianity as part and parcel of this kind of quite forward, national kind of identity.
Okay. Yeah.
And so it's kind of brought up these now debates and discussions around, nationalism versus patriotism and everything else. I mean, first of all, why do you think that far-right groups, activists, are sort of holding on now or conveying this conviction in Christianity in a way that sometimes doesn't seem very deep at all? But what's going on there?
So I'm really glad that you've asked about this. It's super important, and particularly for a lot of your listeners, I think, to hear about this. The first thing I want to say is I think Christian nationalism, which is something we're seeing in America, seeing in Russia, in lots of parts of the world and across Europe. Christian nationalism, to me, is an oxymoron. In the New Testament, the holy nation is the people of God, and they're people of all races, all languages, all tribes. So the idea that one nation can identify itself as having kind of particular purposes within God's plan for the world, and that we are better because we are a Christian people who live here, that's just wrong. I mean, that's just not what the New Testament says. And the Eastern Church calls this a heresy, ethnophilitism, which is, not entirely ironic, because this I think people saw this coming. That's the direction that the Russian Orthodox Church has taken. That's different to a kind of Christian-informed patriotism, which I think perhaps relates a bit more to what I've described in relation to a sort of celebration of the heritage of this country and a recognition of the monarch as an anointed Christian sovereign. I think a lot of the people, though, who are identifying on the far right with Christianity, as you say, are not really going that deeply. I saw some research a few years ago that was looking at the phenomenon of Christian nationalism across Europe, and what this guy basically found was the best antidote to being a Christian nationalist was going to church. The people who were going to church weren't saying these things. They were much more open to immigrants, much more open towards Islam in particular. So there is some kind of badge that's being worn in all of this. And I think it's complicated to explain. It's tapping into some dark periods of history, I think, tapping into some discourses that have emerged around civilizations, going back to Samuel Huntington's book, The Clash of Civilizations, and the way in which, as sort of modern nation states are kind of struggling, they're falling back on cultural foundations, religion being the strongest form of culture. And so there is this kind of Christian nationalism, I think, as a sort of fairly hollow kind of cultural badge that people are wearing. But I also, these are people with grievances. These are people who are angry and disaffected with elites who they believe have not served them well and in some ways haven't. And I think as a Christian, I would also want to say that, a lot of those elites did also quite detrimentally play down Christian identity and Christian heritage. And so I think some of those people are recognizing that our society has lost its way a bit. And that has got something to do with kind of not keeping Christianity as vital as it might be within our culture. And I would also say, one of the things about Islamophobia, any kind of phobia, is often about a kind of envy that people have. And I think a lot of people in Western Europe look at the Muslim communities that have come in and see actually very cohesive communities where people have a story and practices that hold their community together, and they call each other brother and sister. And we've been bowling alone, as Philip Putnam says. We've been living in a very individualistic society. So I think there is a sense, and I don't think this is at all conscious in a lot of these kind of angry people, that there is a resentment of Islam and other communities because we've lost something. And so I think that they are grasping after something true and important that's been denied them, or that they haven't paid enough attention to. But, they're really doing it in a very damaging way.
It's like a perverse version of the nostalgia, I think, that you referred to, but almost misapplied, perhaps.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Is the church doing enough to counter this trend? Because it seems as though unabated, it could be, or unchallenged, it could be something that takes over quite significantly, perhaps.
I think we need to be really, really alert to this. And I'm sure there's more we need to do, and we need to figure out what it is. Because I think there's a lot of people in the church, and particularly in leadership, our bishops, who quite rightly recognise some of the grievances that I've been talking about that are present in those often white working class communities, don't want to alienate them, don't want to push them away from the church, don't want to tell them you're just racist, just bigoted. But we also need to stand up and say, this isn't Christianity. And so what we need to do is we need to show them what Christianity is. And, say, well, okay, you're calling yourselves a Christian, see you in church on Sunday, come and join in, see what we do, come and help at the food bank, come and listen to everything that Jesus has to say about loving your enemy and the stranger.
And immigrants.
The immigrants. Yeah. And the religious other. The parable of the Good Samaritan, one of the most famous stories that Jesus told, is really about an openness to the person with whom Jesus's hearers had very angry religious disagreement. So, you know, we need to articulate that in a way that invites people in rather than inflames the culture war. And I think we're all in this kind of struggle at the moment, aren't we, to kind of make public interventions that don't fuel polarization, but actually draw people together.
Very difficult. I mean, who are there prominent voices that you are supportive of in this regard that you think are doing a good job?
I do hear bishops saying good and important things. I think on the whole, as a church, we're still figuring out what to say. And also, you may have noticed we've been rather preoccupied with our own crises, which is not a good thing. And I think people are trying to figure out what do we say as a national church about a religiously plural society. And to be honest, I do think a lot of people in the church could listen to what our Supreme Governor, King Charles, says a lot of the time. I think he's been far more alert to these questions for a lot longer than many of us have.
A lot of this stuff, a lot of people's opinions, the culture wars that you refer to, is happening online. You know, I just in the last few months when I was kind of looking at, I was quite disturbed actually by just how viral so many kind of hate-filled kind of videos, are just on YouTube. I mean, I don't even tend to look at other social media much at all, and it's probably there in other places. It's even more extensive. It seems to me that in this case, to the extent that the church is going to deal with any of this stuff, it's got to have a very significant online presence. I'm not sure that it does at the moment, and is there that internal discussion about actually are we can have the right message, but if we're just talking to a few rows of churchgoers on Sundays, it's not going to cut through. And a lot of this debate is happening out there. So is that something that's relevant that needs to be sort of considered?
So I think the church very consciously tried to increase its online presence over the last few years, and I think we found it a pretty bloody and bruising experience, and it fueled our own internal divisions, and it drew us into culture wars and polarization that off so easily spirals out of control. And of course, part of the dangers of the online space is that you don't these days even know who's real. So much of the noise there is now bots and deliberate malicious interventions by states and other actors who do want this country to fall apart and do want Christians and Muslims to have an almighty civilizational clash. So I think actually I'm not convinced that going online, is the right thing to do. And what I hope for Archbishop Sarah when she's enthroned next year is that we pay a lot of attention to renewing our in-person community and the work that parishes are doing all over the country actually in reaching out to mosques and synagogues and other faith groups to really strengthen face-to-face, in-person relationships, community relationships. And then I think our public interventions have got to be very considered and judicious, and it's really difficult.
Yeah, that's the thing. I suppose I'm not sure what those interventions look like right now.
No, me neither.
Meaning, if we're going to say, well, actually, the online space is just too much of a cesspit. It's just too messy to get involved with. But the problem is if the voices that might offer some illumination are going to retreat, well, that's just going to leave more darkness in that space, which is becoming really most people's real space, right? That's most people's actual reality.
Except that we're seeing younger people coming off social media.
Sure, to a certain degree,
yeah. Shift in this country, not in America, curiously, but I think that is. We shall see, but I'm not convinced that the generation coming through have as much faith in those online spaces to give them the narratives that the previous generations, or kind of the generation before them, did.
Okay,
we'll see. But I do take your point about a kind of a strong church voice, and I think of the former Bishop of London, Richard Charters, who's been a supporter of the centre that I've set up. He used to say, we are tolerant not because we believe so little, but because we believe so much. And I think we need a version of that for now. We need to say we are a plural country, not because we're all over the place and we don't believe anything or we're incoherent, but because we are strong and we have good community relations, and we respect one another and we listen to one another. And we need a version of that for now.
You spoke about church crises, and you also mentioned the Archbishop. For those who have no idea, what are the major crises affecting the church right now?
So, gosh, I mean, that's a whole other podcast, really. I think we've experienced the kind of crisis that all institutions are experiencing in terms of a loss of trust, a suspicion of hierarchy, polarization of opinion around a number of different issues. Having a female Archbishop of Canterbury is one of those issues people are polarized around. Same-sex blessings of same-sex relationships, that's another issue that we're polarizing around. But actually, there's a number of things. And I think the technology hasn't helped us. I think Church of England politics has played out mostly on Twitter over the last few years in a way that's not been edifying. So we're dealing with all of that. And like a lot of other institutions, we're also confronting the sins of the past. And faith communities are spaces of high trust, and where there is high trust, there is abuse of trust. And so we're dealing with cases of children and vulnerable adults having been abused by clergy and others over decades, over centuries, of course. And not dealing with that well, dealing with that in a way that is defensive rather than generous and repentant. And that all came to a head for Archbishop Justin, who felt that he had to stand down in relation to that. So we've had no Archbishop of Canterbury for a year, and Bishop Sarah will take up those responsibilities in a couple of months' time. And I hope for a period where we can be kinder to one another and kind of renew our trust in one another as an institution, and stop looking inwards and look outwards, both in how we're articulating the gospel to the country, but also how we're taking responsibility as an established church for religious minorities and enabling those conversations. And to be fair, that's been going on, all this last year, and through very difficult times for interfaith relations.
Mm-hmm. From what I've been seeing, she has possibly one of the most unenviable tasks ahead of her.
Absolutely.
I mean, it almost feels as though she's already been in post for long enough and had dealing with all these challenges. I mean, what would you be if you were her sort of a special advisor, prime advisor? What would you be advising her with? What would you suggest should be her kind of top priorities?
Well, I think my first advice to her would be: don't go on social media. Have a comms officer. Leave it all to them.
Just on that though, actually, I'm gonna just. You mentioned trust earlier, and sometimes that's the kind of approach that maybe leaders take sometimes, which then doesn't help them as well.
Yeah, no, I know what you're saying.
Like, which is almost, I know on the other extreme you have like the Trump style thing, which are loathe him or love him, but the point being is he puts himself out there, and actually, it's kind of, well, at least you know what you're dealing with, essentially.
But just as a human being who I like, for Bishop Sarah, misogyny online is just off the charts. I mean, female MPs experience this. It's so insidious, and so I think, for a strong male leader, we can say, kind of, get your message out there, and think it's really ugly for women. I think we need to kind of acknowledge that. But no, it's about authenticity, isn't it? Actually, and kind of being able to hear where people are coming from and hear some honesty in their voice. which often, the comms office or filter can take away.
Yeah, because then you end up with the kind of politician style, robotic.
Yeah.
I want to say Starmer-esque.
Yeah.
kind of,
Well, that's a whole other conversation. I mean, who would be in charge of anything these days? But what would I say to her? Are her priorities, what they should be? I think there's been a lot of anxiety in the Church of England over the last 2 decades for the reason that you pointed to, of kind of seeming rapid decline and feeling like we kind of need the magic formula to turn the ship around and get the strategy in and get the communications right and all of that. And my experience has been that within the church, because that hasn't had a huge impact, has led to a lot of blame. So everyone's kind of pointing the finger at other people and saying, well, it's because of you and your influence on things that we're not growing. And if we all did things my way, and if we embraced my theology and the way I see things, then we'd have this great revival, this great renewal. And that's a fantasy as well. So I think we need to. She needs to figure out how we can hear one another better and just be kinder to one another. And then I think just renew our commitment to the basics. I've just finished writing a book which will be coming out at the end of this year, on church life, just on what it means to be Christian community and what it means to try and build Christian community in the very turbulent times in which we live. And I think, and this comes out of my experience of working with students in many ways, I think people are really struggling to find their agency in the face of huge challenges. Climate crisis, obviously, is sort of the ultimate example, but escalating conflicts that we feel helpless to do anything about, all kinds of injustices and inequalities. And I think at the end of the day, the ethical imperative that falls on all of us is to build community around us. And, that's the ethical imperative that Christians are called to. Build the church, be part of the church, show up, worship, say your prayers, read the Bible, help at the food bank, help at the winter night shelter, do all these basic things that make you a good person. And I think it's the sum of those good Christian communities of other faiths that lead to big change. So to Bishop Sarah, I'd say, help us renew the parishes, renew basic church life, get people reading the Bible, get people saying their prayers, because we've drifted from this as well. It's not just the extremists who look at the Muslim community and say, well, these people are kind of very disciplined about their prayer lives and they're memorizing the Quran and all the rest of it. And we've lost a lot of those habits that we need to renew.
Yeah, it's the old school simple things that.
Yeah.
And what are the kind of things that? How do you think she would respond to that? Do you think she would say? No, probably wouldn't come as a surprise, maybe.
No,
yeah.
It's not.
I don't actually. I'm not aware. Maybe you can tell me. Has she already set out like what her priorities are? Like in terms of, was that something that's going to emerge?
She's made various public statements. I think the reputation she has, you may know, before she got ordained, she was the chief nursing officer
That's right,
within the NHS. So she's used to running a large complex organization, and the church certainly is a large complex organization. Kind of getting things running better, I think, is something that she will do well. I think she's had criticism as well, but I think she has been good at listening to marginalized voices within the church and outside of the church. And I think that's going to be part of her agenda. But I was just at her leaving service as Bishop of London at St Paul's last weekend, and it was very much a call to recognising that the disagreement within the church isn't something we can fix, isn't something that's going to go away. You read the New Testament and it's already there. Christians have always disagreed about things. And maybe that's part of the ecosystem. Maybe that's part of what we need. And actually, this is where I think this is true for society at large at the moment. One of our greatest challenges, maybe our greatest challenge, is figuring out how we can disagree better, how we can create spaces, and we've been talking about it as a university, how we can be a site where contested issues are dealt with well, and where we can really kind of hear one another and challenge one another and stand up for what we believe in. So the task that the church has is not different in that respect to wider society.
Over the last 2 and a bit years, there's probably been no more contested issue than obviously what's been happening in Gaza. And in your own way, you've been sort of at the heart of maybe dealing with or navigating the different views and the different groups, on campus with regards to this particular issue. Could you just talk more about sort of your role, the role that you've been playing, and just the experience that you've had in actually trying to manage a space in which some very strongly held sort of views are being put forward?
It's been really, really challenging. It's been really difficult, and there's been a huge amount of anger and emotion. And sometimes my job is just making space for that anger and emotion to be vented and heard. But then the next step, as part of my job, is to just remind people that we share an institution with people who see things differently. And you may think that they are profoundly wrong, wickedly wrong. But we have to reach the point of understanding that they hold their views in good faith and for good reasons. And if we get no further than that, then that's a start. But maybe that can lead us to sit down with them and hear what those views are, and them in turn hearing where we're coming from and why we feel so strongly about this. And one of the things I say regularly to students is that empathy is not agreement. If you understand and even relate a little bit to where someone's coming from, it doesn't mean you're condoning that view, or you're saying this is all right for this person to hold this view. It may even be the tool that you're given to persuading them that they're wrong. Because when you see why someone holds something strongly, what they're afraid of, then you can help kind of address those concerns and get them to see this other perspective. That's the challenge that's been really hard over the last couple of years. And we're still struggling with it. And also, I have friends in that region, in both Palestine and Israel. And I have my own views and my own kind of political convictions and commitments. And overriding all of that is my conviction that there will be no solution to this problem that doesn't involve some kind of coming together and some kind of dialogue, because there is no conflict that has been resolved without an appalling bloodbath that doesn't involve that doesn't involve dialogue. And so one of the things that really saddens me about the last 2 years is that dialogue itself has become a dirty word, and there's profound suspicion around it. But we've got to keep the flag flying for it, and we've got to keep saying we need it.
Have you, would you describe the role that you've been playing, at the LSE over the last couple of years in this regard as the best that it's got to is almost just a keeping of the peace? Or is it that actually you have seen a sort of, a kind of maturation or evolution of perspective that you would say actually has been quite healthy and encouraging? Or has it just been, no, you've just managed to prevent things from boiling over?
Well, we haven't always done that.
Okay.
It's been really challenging. I think I've seen in some individuals a journey and a moving beyond the paralysis of anger and lack of agency towards recognizing that, well, maybe there is agency in conversation, in dialogue, in listening. I've seen that in some individuals. Interestingly, for us as a centre, and so your listeners have some idea, I run a centre for interreligious engagement, and we run programs that really promote religious literacy, where people can learn about other people's religions, but also leadership skills around dialogue and conflict transformation, with a focus on both religion-related conflict and also the challenges of climate change. What we've seen over the last couple of years actually has not been a drop in participation in our programs, but a bit of a shift in who's taking up. So I think actually that Gaza and other things that are going on in the world are making a wider set of students at LSE say, oh, this stuff matters, this is interesting, I want to learn more, I want to get involved. But we've seen a drop-off in students of stronger religious conviction, certainly in the Muslim community, in the Jewish community, but actually kind of across the board. And I think that this didn't just start on the 7th of October. I think this has been a longer trend linked to religion's entanglement in identity politics and a kind of insularity that's creeping up within all our faith communities, and a suspicion of the religious other and the suspicion of people who encourage us to talk to them.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, what's dominated the Muslim perspective on this is that there can be no real good faith dialogue until what by any standards has been the most horrific kind of destruction really of so many innocent lives, until that is actually recognized as wrong is wrong. There's no sort of going around that kind of issue.
No, and I respect people who hold that view. I think I would also ask, can we talk about something else? Can we talk about something where we have a common cause? I've been involved outside of LSE in more community relations than I was. I've been drawn into that by the people in the Church of England leadership who take responsibility for this stuff and feel passionately about it. And those conversations have really, and just to enable those conversations, we've said, look, there is going to be no agreement on this. And we're not going to tell you what you can say and what you can't say about this conflict. And, if you enter this space, then you're going to hear things that are unsettling to your worldview in relation to this. But you all live in the same community, and you've got to try and find a way to live together and get through this and carry on the important projects that you've been doing together over decades in many cases. And, what we found is actually kind of playing on that civic belonging and the recognition that even now there's some sort of ceasefire. This conflict is with us for a long time, and it may get worse still. Are we really going to say that that means this kind of perpetual state of tension and hostility within British communities indefinitely? And so we've had good conversations, I'm pleased to say, in relation to that. And then more broadly at LSE, we've got this big focus on climate change. This is a huge planetary emergency that affects more than just the Middle East. It's affecting the whole world. Can we not have a conversation about that? I think we can, and I think we can. So I'm quite a pragmatist when it comes to interfaith engagement, and I think we just kind of need these conversations and need these encounters for a number of reasons. And I respect people who withdraw for reasons of principle and needing to kind of have certain criteria met, but there is a cost to that.
Yeah. At the time of the sort of new atheist sort of rise, just changing gears slightly, I remember thinking in the context of intra-Muslim discussions and debates that were going on, how sort of irrelevant they seemed, given this kind of external threat, if you wanted to say, to just faith as a whole. And certainly even at that time, even inter-religious discussions and debates and divisions also seeming kind of quite irrelevant when, again, there was a common enemy, if you want to say, which was posing a threat. And it obviously has had, it had its effects, essentially. Similarly today, now, when just to bring maybe different aspects of the discussion together, it seems partly why I myself have been interested in exploring or just understanding more about the different traditions, the way we see each other, whether there are the resources within each of these traditions to maybe go beyond just a kind of pragmatic toleration to a more principled pluralism / acceptance, is because the common enemy that I see that exists is almost this technological, robotic, AI, maybe AGI kind of threat, which which is all tied up with this so almost transhumanist agenda, right? Like actually, whilst we are fighting and bickering and debating all sorts of different issues within each of our spaces, there's this tidal wave coming, which it's not exactly. It's something which is very visible. It's being talked about, but it's one of those weird things that you see, like everyone's talking about how things are going to so dramatically change, even by 2030, which is just around the corner. Let alone God knows what it's going to look like by the time we get to 40, 50. That as an issue just seems to me from certainly I would say from a Muslim perspective, I feel like there's almost zero attention being given to that whole thing, as if, and I think there's a very unrealistic stance that's almost held towards it, which is almost that actually this is something which you can manage. You can almost, through some basic personal habits, you might just be able to, ward off the harmful effects of the technology that's coming. I mean, when you think about this now, both in a personal sense as well as maybe what's happening on campus in terms of these discussions, do you feel, what's your perspective on what's coming and the threats that it poses, and what, if anything, can we do to resist what sometimes feels like an inevitable sort of a takeover and redefinition of even what it means to be human?
Yeah. There's a number of enormous challenges and threats. I've talked about the climate emergency. I think the technological questions you raise are as pressing and as existential. And yes, I want to convene an interfaith space as well as a space within the church that's addressing these questions rather than the trivial things we get distracted by. And I think a big conversation that people of faith should be having right now is, what does it mean to be human? Because that's really the question at stake in a lot of these AI issues. Even just the term AI, we talk about artificial intelligence. You can't really have a conversation about artificial intelligence until you decide what intelligence is. And I don't think we have a very sophisticated understanding of that, you're kind of in common parlance. And I think religious traditions have really important wisdom to bring to the table about what we think is significant about being a human, and the role that we play within a broader non-human creation, that we need to reflect on in order to navigate some of these questions that are going to be raised about what machines can do instead of humans, or really whether machines are going to be better than humans at doing certain things. Defending the human, I think, is going to be a real challenge over the next few years. And if people of faith don't do it, I don't know who will.
Again, and then just to again link it to a lot of the discussion we've been having, do you think that again the church is alert to this? Is this also something you might say Sarah needs to add to her her list?
I mean, we don't spend nearly as much time on it as we do squabbling about the trivial things that we squabble about. So there are these conversations happening. There are people thinking about it. I'm encouraged ecumenically, that is to say, kind of in relation to other Christian churches, that Pope Leo is very alert to this, and has been thinking about this for some time. And I think if Pope Francis characterized his papacy by the attention he paid to climate change, I think Pope Leo is really going to help us navigate this period of time when, as you say, we're going to see very rapid shifts in the embedding of this technology in everyday life. And I think the Vatican's going to be raising some very critical questions about that, rooted in what's always been very important in Roman Catholicism, which is the sanctity of human life and the sanctity of the human. So there are Christian conversations happening, but we should be doing more. And I think people are very overwhelmed. I mean, people are overwhelmed generally about everything that's going on in the world, and actually to kind of carve out the time to read around this and pay attention to it and think through the implications. There's very few people, able to do that.
Yeah, it is tough. And actually, even when that work is done, and even if points of view are communicated, it seems as though there is such an asymmetry of power and resources which are being applied to that sit on various sides of this equation, such that I don't know, this is one area where I think the nostalgia is perfectly well justified, to be honest, which is to say that actually I don't know, I feel very despondent about what the effects of all of this is going to be, and I just personally don't see it almost as it does feel like an inevitable, almost redefinition, sort of takeover, and there's some of those existential risks which people speak about right now. Like, I don't know, if I was a betting man, then I would reluctantly say, yeah, probably, because we just humanity or human beings generally haven't shown ourselves to be particularly trustworthy when it comes to having such power and resources at our disposal, essentially. But now the effects or the influence that comes with that, and with technology scaling everything so rapidly, and it just seems like something very difficult to resist.
Well, I think this is, this is a justice issue in some ways, in that I'm appalled by the enormous amounts of money that's being made by people pioneering this technology who've completely taken their foot off the brake and are just careering towards they know not what, but they're just kind of flooding their bank accounts with cash. And again, both your faith and mine have something to say about people who do things like that, and I think we shouldn't be afraid to say that. I'm a little bit more optimistic for two reasons. One is that this question about what does it mean to be human. I think we've got into a secular society that radically underestimates the human and human capacities, and there's a lot about humans that we just sort of ignore. So I think a lot of people look at what computers are doing and saying, oh, this is like a superhuman, but we don't that's because we've for a long time thought about humans as if they're computers. Mm-hmm. We think about and we talk about humans as if they're machines. We talk about humans having kind of breakdowns as if they're cars, and we talk about people being kind of burnt out. Humans are much more resilient and interesting, and the way in which the mind works is far more complex. And I think we're going to realise that. And in some way, I mean, one might say, well, this is just a refining of the technology, but we're seeing huge errors being made by AI all the time. And I suspect that might kind of be inbuilt, and that humans have greater capacity for achieving something a bit more special. So I think we're going to discover a bit more about human distinctiveness. I also think, in relation to this justice issue, I think there's going to be a big backlash. I think there's going to be a sort of rebellion, and I don't think people are going to sleepwalk into unemployment and poverty, because we can't afford universal basic income, as a response to this. So I think it could potentially be the springboard for a new kind of politics that actually is really emancipatory and that galvanizes human communities in new ways. So I want to try and be hopeful.
Well, thank you for counterbalancing my pessimism. All right. Well, we've got to conclude shortly. Briefly, what do you hope to be working on sort of next? Your next big project after you spoke about this book, which is going to be coming out later on. What's next for you after that? Because this is your fifth book, right? Fourth, fifth?
Sort of. It's cheating when you edit a book, because other people do the writing and you just put it together.
So I take the credit.
This will be the third book that I've written.
Okay.
I mean, what am I working on? I don't have a book project in mind at the moment, and I think I've got some kind of engagement with the world projects, which are the things that we've been talking about. So I really want to be part of this conversation about how we respond to Christian nationalism through bringing the wisdom and experience of good interfaith relations and an understanding of religious pluralism into dialogue about national identity and citizenship. And I think that conversation's urgent, and through various channels, I want to be more involved in that. I also think that this is the decade that will make or break the climate emergency, and I'm keen to. I think for a long time we've been thinking about that as a kind of technocratic problem, which can be solved by scientists and politicians getting together at the COP summit or whatever. We've now realised that that's not working, and that we need more of a moral narrative around the climate. And again, this is an area where religious traditions have so much to bring to the table. And that's really work that we've been involved in a lot, particularly with Christian and Muslim communities. We did some field work in the Middle East with Coptic and Anglican Christians and Muslim communities on how they're talking about their lived experience of rising temperatures and water shortages, and drawing on Quranic and biblical passages, and using that as a basis for a new kind of interfaith conversation. So I really want to drive that forward over the next few years, because I think there's a need for that, and there's an openness to that among those who care passionately about this.
And I think a nice way to finish off, and I'm sorry to put you on the spot with this, but might be for you to give us a 1 minute sermon based on, perhaps, is there a particular Bible verse or short passage that comes to mind that you think, actually, yeah, this is something that maybe captures the mood, or is something we can all kind of learn from, pay attention to?
Oh goodness, this is just like how we started, with you putting me on the spot with the kind of a grand theological discourse.
The Inquisition is over now. That's fine.
One of my favourite sayings of Jesus in John's Gospel: "I came that they may have life and have it in abundance." And a lot of my spiritual life and ministry is a reflection on what it means to have life in abundance, because it doesn't mean the kind of abundance that capitalism's talking about in terms of what we accumulate. How to live really fully and generously, and for me, that's fundamentally about relationships, which is why I've written this book about building community as the church. But it's why I get so much joy and sense of purpose, even when it's difficult, from interfaith engagement, because I think Jesus' vision of life is for all people, and it's in the endless connecting of people, the endless gathering up of all things in Christ. It's described in the letter to the Ephesians in the New Testament, and that work of making more connections, of enriching our own lives and others. That's my sermon for you.
Well, thank you so much. No, I really appreciate it. Really appreciate you coming on and sharing your perspectives.
We've certainly been around the houses. It's been a great conversation.
No, thank you so much. And wish you all the very best. And I hope we can keep our relationship going, keep the dialogue going. And
I'm sure we will.
May God help and guide us all through these difficult times. But hopefully light at the end of the tunnel. But thank you so much.